Hey, I'm Jared. This week we're going to be talking about time, and what would you say is your biggest time sink? If it's anywhere close to mine, it's probably the internet, and there's a reason for that. I just saw a stat that said 100 years ago, the amount of information a person received in an entire lifetime is the amount of information that you and I receive every single day. I looked up what the number one searches were from last year, and they were this. How do I use the update for Snapchat? How do I solve the Rubik's Cube, that's legit, I looked that up. And then how do I receive legendary marks? I had no idea what that was, so now of course I added to the stats by looking that up. Now that stuff's pretty harmless, but there's a lot of images that come, there's a lot of things that you look, there's a lot of sites that you look at that are not necessarily so great. God issues this warning. He says, be very careful how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise. That means take stock of the things you're looking at. Take stock at the things that are going in your brain. Because he goes on to say, the days are evil. There's so much content that we have, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting the right content. How about searches like, how do I love my spouse more completely? Or how do I find fulfillment at work? Or what does God have to say? Or science says this, what does God say? Why does it matter? It probably doesn't matter if you know how to use the Rubik's Cube or not. But when it comes to time, there are images that you never forget. And these images and these videos and these sites change the way you look at yourself. They change the way you look at relationships. They change the way you look at God. And you don't just have any God. You have a God that loves you. You have a God who cares about you. You have a God who really is concerned about what's best for you so that you can have life, as Jesus says, and have it to the full. I'm Jared, and we're talking about time, and it seems like the future is already here. When I was a kid, I looked forward to the year 2000, and according to all the shows, that means you wear like this tight-fitting silver spacesuit. Nobody does that, at least most people don't do that. I watched a show about the future, and it was the Jetsons. You might remember the Jetsons, maybe you've heard of the Jetsons. Well, my impression was that there's a couple things you learn from the Jetsons. Number one, if George can land Jane, there's hope for any man to marry a beautiful woman. And two, life's supposed to get easier. Like George would fly in his flying car and then he'd get out and it would turn into a briefcase. You could just press a button and you get your food. But I don't know about your life, but my life actually is getting more and more complex. I thought as we got to the future, it was gonna get so easy and automated that I work less and I leisure more. That's not the case at all. In fact, that's not the case for just about anybody. It's more complex to be a teacher. It's more complex to be a farmer. It's more complex to be a student. My kids, they come home with stuff that I've never even seen before, and it's this higher critical thinking, and they're in middle school. So what does this all mean? It means that as our life gets more complex, we're tired. Have you ever been there? Like you go home and you just kind of fall into bed and you just can't wait to just kind of be entertained? A guy back in the 80s wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. This is right when the Jetson was on. And his concern was that TV had now become the main medium for public opinion back in the 50s. And of course, today that would be the internet. The average person, they say, watches TV for 5 hours a day. They say they watch the internet for a couple hours a day. So what does this mean? Yesterday we talked about what we put into our brain. Today we're talking about you don't have unlimited amount of time, and God even says that. Through Moses, he says, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. You tell me, are you gaining wisdom by staring at a screen and cat videos and what the people have wasted their time on who make all kinds of money? Or are you going to gain a heart of wisdom by talking to the creator of the world? Not just the creator of the world, the creator of you. And who better understands how you function, what is best for you, than our God? I'm Jared. This whole week we've been talking about time, how to make the most of our days and how to make the most of what goes into our head, but also get the most out of living our life for our God. So I don't know how big your town is. Mine's not especially big. It's about 50,000 people. And that's on the upper end of an estimate at how big a town called Ephesus was. They said about 30,000 to 50,000 people. And this town is important because it's actually named in the Bible. There's a book called Ephesians. And a follower of Jesus writes a letter to the people who live there. And he says this, his name is Paul. He says, be very careful how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. We talked about that. But then the next section says, make the most of every opportunity. What's really interesting is the terms he uses. Opportunity here literally is time, and there's a couple words that we use for time in the Bible, in the Greek language. One is chronos, which may sound familiar if you watch Incredibles, that's Syndrome's secret plan to destroy the world. But it is also like an actual time. It's like 3 p.m. So Paul isn't saying to the people like in this Batman trainer voice, like, make the most of 3 p.m. He's saying kairos, which is a little bit different. It's not an actual time. He's saying make the most of really the moment. They say opportunity, but make the most of those moments. So what this means is we not only have limited days on this planet, but within each day we have limited moments. If your life is anything like mine, it seems like there's always time for work as we're more and more and more, and the people who are left out are these relationships. I read the average working person spends less than 2.5 minutes per day in meaningful conversation with their spouse or significant other. 2.5 minutes a day, so that's 15 minutes a week. But it's worse for kids. The average working person spends less than 30 seconds a day in meaningful conversation with their kids. So what this means is if you have houseplants and you water these plants, 5 minutes a week, you're spending as much time with your houseplants as with your kids. What's our encouragement? We have limited time on this planet, limited days, but we also have limited moments in each day. So make the most of those moments. And what I mean by that is don't just say, hey, I have 30 seconds with my kids, let's get quality time. I'm saying let's blow these stats out of the water. Let's recommit ourselves to the things that really matter, because work is a big deal, of course. School is a big deal, but relationships are even bigger. So let's take time to express how God feels about them to them, and let's take time to express how we feel about them in real meaningful conversation beyond 2.5 minutes or beyond 30 seconds. I'm Jared. This whole week we've been talking about time, and today we talk about how do we determine what are the most important things in our life. There's a pretty famous story that was made famous by a guy named Stephen Covey. He's a time management guru. But he tells the story of a professor who, in her college class, puts a jar, and she starts to put these big rocks in the jar. And she asks the class, is the jar full? And the class, of course, is like, well, yeah. But then she starts to put in smaller rocks, and then asks again, is the jar full? And they're kind of onto her, I think, at this point. So they say, yes. Well, then she adds sand, and she fills the jar up to the top. And what's the point of that story? You would think that Stephen Covey, a time management guru, would say if you really are careful, you can pack your life full, but that's not it. The point is if you start with sand and you start with just small stones, you cannot fit the big things into the jar. You gotta start with the big things to get them done. So what are your big things? What are your rocks that you would say are important? My guess is yours are pretty similar to mine. If you're watching a video like this, you have a desire to grow in your relationship with God. That's one of my rocks. Grow in my relationship with my spouse or other person in your life. Grow in my relationship with my kids, my friends. I want to be healthy. I want to be financially stable. These are things that matter to me. My guess is if someone asked you, like, what are your big rocks? And you literally had to write on a rock and say, this is what's most important to me. I don't think it would say, check fantasy football scores. You know, I don't think it would say, like, look up Lamar Odom and the Kardashians. I don't think it would say, burn the day on Facebook. Could you imagine yourself writing that out? That stuff's sand. You know, sand's great. You can make a castle, but you don't build a house on sand. You don't build a life on sand. You don't build anything on sand. You build it on a rock. You build it on the rock. Take a minute now. I mean it. Write down what are the most important things in your life and decide, am I spending my life on rocks? Or am I spending it on sand? Jesus gives you this encouragement. He says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man. He's talking about his word, is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. It's Jared. It's been a great week. We're on Friday, and we've been talking this whole week about time. And time is interesting because it's motivating when you talk about time, because how can we invest and make the most of our days, and how can we make the most of our moments? But it also makes us feel guilty. That's what happens to me when you see stats about how much time we spend watching TV or how much time we spend on the internet. If you're anything like me, that there's like this weight that comes over. Then you realize how little time we have spent in our relationships, how little time we've spent in the things that really matter. So this week, my encouragement to you was to look and say, what's most important in my life? Let's spend our time on that. And all the other stuff, burning time on the internet and burning our time just watching TV, that's sand. And we're not going to build our life on sand. This weekend, identify what matters. Go spend some time with your family, spend some time with your friends, find other Christians and encourage them and be encouraged by them. Because God makes a promise. He says when the time had fully come at just the right moment, he sent his son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those who are obligated by the law. That's you and me. God's request to you is this: use your time perfectly. We just can't do it. I mean, no one uses their time perfectly. So if you're feeling guilt from this last week about talking about time, you've got a God where you can bring these things to him and you say, God, I am sorry for these things. You can seek him for forgiveness. You know why? I said no one on this whole planet has lived and used their time perfectly except one. Because at just the right moment, at just the right day, God sent a son into this world to live perfectly and a job to do. He went his whole life without sin. He goes to a cross without sin to pay for the sins of the entire world. The world includes everyone. It certainly includes you. It's been a great week. I've really enjoyed spending time with you as we talk about time. My encouragement again is get out this weekend, spend your time on the things that actually matter, identify those things, and let's live a life in God's love and God's grace and motivated by him because of what he's done for us.